Good evening. I'm Father Alexander. This is St. Peter's Parish in Hove, and here am I talking to a computer that I thought only this morning had died. But luckily, it's come back to life. So you can hear from me again. Now, I want to talk about the book of Nehemiah. We got to the first bit, which is Nehemiah rebuilds the walls of Jerusalem. It underlines for us the centrality of Jerusalem in the Jewish world vision. Jerusalem is the holy city. Funnily enough, we shouldn't criticize our Jewish brethren for having this almost obsession with Jerusalem as the holy city, because we too believe in holy cities, except we don't have one holy city, we have lots of holy cities. That is to say, places which are special, places where it is easier to get into contact with God, places where it's easier to access the divine dimension of life more easy than in other places. Every city can be a holy city, by the way, but some places are easier than others to get through to God. Obviously, Rome is a holy city. For me, the most holy city on earth is probably Assisi, I think. It's just an absolutely wonderful place. And Lourdes is a holy city, and so it goes on. Now, having rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem, there's something else that our Jewish brethren have to do. Having restored Jerusalem, Jerusalem is built as a city strongly compact. It is there that the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord, as we later hear in the book of Psalms. But there's something else that is central to the Jewish way of life, and that is, of course, the book of the law. Now, what is this book of the law? Well, the book of the law is the book of Deuteronomy, we assume, and it is taken out and read for the people. Now, this has been done before in the time of Josiah, when, of course, the book of the law was rediscovered in the temple. And now it's read by Ezra before the assembly, consisting of men, women, and all those old enough to understand. This is verse 3, chapter 8. And he reads the law from dawn until noon. So it takes about 6 hours to read the law. And it says, this is very important, all the people listened attentively to the book of the law, well, as they should. But it also says this, Ezra read from the book of the law of God, translating and giving the sense. So the reading was understood. In other words, Ezra reads the book of the law, which is in Hebrew, and then he translates it into Aramaic so that people can understand what is being said. Now, this tells us that after the exile, the Jewish people had lost the habit of speaking in Hebrew every day, though they had retained Hebrew as a sacred language, clearly in their liturgy. But they were just speaking the lingua franca of the Middle East, Aramaic. If you remember, back in the siege of Jerusalem, when Sennacherib turned up, they say, don't speak to us in Aramaic, they say, and don't speak to us in the language of Judea. So they have lost their own language. This is rather important because your language is what makes you a people, quite often, not always. So, for example, our Welsh brethren are very keen on speaking Welsh, and quite rightly, because it is part of their identity and part of their culture, and therefore something they desperately want to keep going, and they have succeeded in keeping going. With English, it's not so important because English is a shared language with many, many nations. But for the Jews, they've lost their own language. And indeed, it's rather interesting, is it not, that our Jewish brethren over the years, they first of all started speaking Hebrew, then they spoke Aramaic, which is what they spoke in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, and also at the time of Jesus. Then, of course, they were sent into exile. Many of them actually spoke in the time of Jesus Greek, such as Philo was a Greek speaker who was more or less contemporary with Jesus. And then, of course, as they went into exile, they spoke every language under the sun. And then, of course, in our own time, they spoke Yiddish and or Ladino, depending whether they were Ashkenazi or Sephardi. And now, having gone back to Israel, they're speaking Hebrew once more. But Hebrew was not a spoken language for almost 2,000 years. Extraordinary that it was revived as a spoken language. It's almost as if, let's say, people said, let's all go and live in Rome and let's start speaking Latin again. Nobody speaks Latin, but it could be revived as a spoken language. Hebrew is rather difficult to speak, I imagine, but they manage it rather well. Anyway, here we have Ezra translating and giving the sense of the law so that people could understand it. God speaks in the law. God wants us to understand the law. God does not want us to say, oh yeah, I've heard that, and then go off and do something else. He wants us to take his law to heart. Once again, and I've said this many times, I think, as we've been going through the Old Testament, God reveals himself to us as the supreme lawgiver. God is a lawgiver. And this is what God is, and this is what God wants us to understand him to be. And being a lawgiver is not a bad thing. Now, when we think of lawgivers in our modern way, we assume that the law is blind justice. That is to say, the lady who signifies justice has wearing a blindfold, which shows complete impartiality. In other words, the law is neutral. In other words, the law is cold. In other words, the law has no feelings. But God, the lawgiver, is full of love, and his law is a message of love to us. It's not neutral. How could God be neutral about human beings? It's just not possible. It's not indifferent. It's not blindfolded. It's not impersonal. God is giving us a law which is full of love. I'll give you an example. If ever you've been unfortunate enough to be stopped for speeding, the policeman will say, do you realize you've been speeding? You've been doing 36 miles an hour and a 30-mile-an-hour limit. And you say, oh, I'm very sorry, officer, etc. Policeman will say, don't you realize that's against the law? And you say, yes, I do realize it's against the law. The policeman won't say, don't you realize how much you've upset all the people who made this law? He won't say that. Because the people who made this law, Parliament, don't care about you. Parliament does not love you. Parliament is not meant to love you. Parliament is meant to be a bureaucracy, essentially, a neutral forum where the best laws are decided. God is not neutral. He's not like that. God, when we break his law, he is sad, in a manner of speaking, because his law is love, and when we break his law, we fail to love him. Now, the people instinctively get this, because listen to what happens. It says here, the people stood up, incidentally, when the law was being read, quite rightly. And the people raised their hands and answered, Amen, Amen. Then they bowed down and faced the ground, prostrated themselves before the Lord, which is an excellent thing to do. And then, now let me just try and find the right bit. Then His Excellency and Nehemiah and the priest scribe Ezra and the Levites who were instructing the people all said to the people, today is sacred to the Lord your God. Do not be mournful, do not weep. For the people were all in tears as they listened to the words of the Lord. That was the bit I was looking for, and that is verse 9. This is a very important verse. The people's response to the law of God is emotion. Now, these are tears of joy or tears of sorrow, but it is emotion. Catholicism, like Judaism, needs to engage the emotions of the person. Sometimes if you see films of the Torah being carried around a synagogue and everybody looking very happy, that is the same sort of thing that is going on here in the book of Nehemiah. The law is in their midst and they are overcome with joy that God has listened to them and given them this great gift. And Ezra says, do not be mournful, do not weep. He said, you may go, eat what is rich, drink what is sweet, and send a helping to the man with nothing prepared. In other words, give something to everybody, where it's a Sabbath day, you see. And the Levites calmed all the people down, saying, keep quiet. This is a sacred day. Do not be sad. When all the people went off to eat and drink and give helpings away and enjoy themselves to the full, since they had understood the meaning of what had been proclaimed to them. Knowledge gives joy. Knowledge of God gives joy. So Nehemiah underlines for us the centrality of the law in Judaism. The law is that beautiful thing in Judaism. It is that which gives joy to the people of God, and it is that which makes the people of God, makes them all one. We too have received the law of God, and we too must act as a community, the community that keeps the law of God. Now, the rest of the book of Nehemiah is a nice long psalm about the history of Israel. which is sort of, and then there are numerous lists about who did what in the temple, who was living in Jerusalem, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, there was how they did up the temple. And Nehemiah finishes off with this, because don't forget, this is Nehemiah speaking. He said, the priests and the Levites who did the wrong thing, they were all sent away, and so on and so forth. At that time, too, I saw Jews had married wives from Ashdod. This is right at the end of the book. And so he gets rid of all the foreign wives and so on. And he stops foreigners selling things in the market on the Sabbath, and so on. In other words, he is a purifier of Jewish practice. And finally, he says, remember this, my God, to my credit. In other words, we have the concept of merit. Nehemiah has done a good work in rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, rebuilding the inhabitants of Jerusalem, rebuilding the community of Israel. And he says, remember this, my God, to my credit. In other words, it's a good work. We too believe in good works. It is, in fact, what is the Jewish word for it? A mitzvah. He has done a merciful work, a good work, and this therefore gets him credit in the sight of God. And from this is one of the first things we have of the doctrine of merit, which is so central to Catholicism. If we do good, God will acknowledge that we have done good and he will reward us. Okay, we'll soon be moving on to the book of Tobit, which is one of my favorite. Hope you've enjoyed that so far. All the very best.